recording the session. So, okay. So I do see we still have people getting admitted into the waiting room. So to start off, we're just going to introduce ourselves. My name is Leah Nicholson, and this is Danielle Sullivan. And we are going to be your presenters today to talk about the FAFSA. So with that being said, before we get started, we'd like to go over a few different housekeeping things. You got this in your email that you received today, but please be sure to make sure that your microphone is muted during the presentation. That way we don't get any feedback from any other background noise or anything along those lines. Also make sure that your video is turned off. This just helps to make sure that our presentation isn't lagging because of a lot of people's video being on. There will be opportunities to ask questions throughout the session as well as at the end of the session. So if at any point you have a question, you are welcome to enter that question into the chat. Or, you know, if we do open up time to answer questions throughout the presentation, we'll leave some space for folks to raise their hand. So you can use that raise your hand function in Zoom, and we will unmute you to ask your question if you'd like to verbally speak that. But if you don't want to talk, you can definitely put that question in the chat at any time, and we'll try to make sure that we are getting to all of those questions. If for some reason we run out of time or we need to check on an answer, we will save the chat and the questions that are in there and get back to you with any answers that come up afterwards. The presentation is being recorded and it will be downloaded onto the CASFA website after we have done the presentation. It will be under training videos on the CASFA website. And then following the session, you will receive an evaluation form by email. So if you would please take the time to fill that out. And of course, you can also put with any answers that we need to there. I think that's everything. So yeah, so to start off, my name is Leah Nicholson. I work at the University of Kansas as an assistant director, oversee various program areas, and have been working in financial aid for about 5 years.
And my name is Danielle Sullivan, and I started off at the Default Resolution Group for Department of Education handling defaulted student loans, and then transitioned to University of Kansas, where I worked for 11 years as an assistant. And now I'm at Johnson County Community College supervising our advising staff, so all of our frontline folks.
Right. So here we go. So today's presentation is going to cover a lot of different topics as it relates to FAFSA. So first and foremost, we're going to go over what the FAFSA is, where you can find the FAFSA, how you apply, changes to the 2021-2022 FAFSA, and common issues that arise when folks are filling it out. We will also discuss what happens after you complete the FAFSA, what are the next steps, who should you talk to. We'll also go over generally the different types of aid that students can be awarded, not only through the FAFSA, but through their institution and the state of Kansas. And then we'll also talk about different resources where you can find handouts and information and other presentations. And then we will go over other events and presentations that are happening through CASFA. So with that being said, let's start off with our first thing. So the very first thing that we'd like to discuss with you is where do you file the FAFSA? So the FAFSA is a free application for federal student aid, and you can go to fafsa.gov to begin the FAFSA. This is where you FAFSA or where you will log in to complete a FAFSA that's already began or been started. And there is 2 different options in terms of language for the FAFSA. So up at the top right screen of fafsa.gov, you'll find that folks have the option to look at this information in English or Spanish. So that's going to be really helpful if you have any Spanish speaking students or families out there who are more comfortable kind of perusing this information in Spanish. So when you get to FAFSA.gov, there are a few pieces of information that parents and students will need to have on hand before they can even get started. So the very first thing that students and parents should have on hand are their social security numbers. So a student is going to need their social security number, and any parents who are going to be listed on the FAFSA will also need their social security numbers. Extremely important because a student's FAFSA is connected to their social security number. That number needs to be correct. Otherwise, the FAFSA is going to have a hard time being processed, and eventually the student would have to go back in and totally fill out a new FAFSA if that social is entered in incorrectly the very first time around. So that social is very important. The second thing that students and parents will need is an FSA ID and password. This is something that they can create before they begin the FAFSA. They can create it at any time, and a student will need an FSA ID, and a parent will also need an FSA ID. We only need one parent to have an FSA ID and password, but it does need to be the parent that is listed on the FAFSA. Those FSA ID and passwords also require that a student and anybody else who's setting that up have an individual email and phone number for each account. So when setting that up, it's really important that students are using a non-school email because, as we all know, when a student leaves high school or they leave a college, sometimes those emails get deleted and they can't access those accounts anymore. So it's really important that they use a non-school email to set up that function. And then the last thing that students and parents will need to have before they start the FAFSA is their 2019 financial information. So the 2021-22 FAFSA will be based off of 2019 tax information for both the student and the parent. So any type of tax returns, W-2s, bank statements, asset information, or untaxed income information should be collected and accessible before they start filling out the FAFSA to make it as easy of a process as possible. So how do you set up your FSA ID and password? So like I said before, both parents and students can get their FSA ID and password at any time. The FAFSA does not have to be open for them to start creating this. So they could do this today if they wanted to. They would do this at fsaid.ed.gov. If they go to fafsa.gov, they'll find information on where they can create an FSA ID. Like I said before, each account must have a unique email address attached to it. So what that means is that a student cannot use the same email that their parent used for their account. So each account has to have its own unique email address. Another thing with setting up the FAFSA is that the FSA ID, we also encourage students and parents to attach a phone number to the account that they're setting up. A phone number is not required during the setup process, but we highly encourage it because it will make the process of retrieving any forgotten passwords a lot easier. So setting up that phone number is super important. Setting up the FSA ID, like the FAFSA, is tied to your social security number. So it is very important that that information is entered in correctly. And again, when setting up an FSA ID and password, the student sets up their own, and then we only need one parent to set up an FSA ID. And it has to be the parent on the FAFSA. So believe it or not, even before filling out the FAFSA, when people are setting up this login information, there are some common issues that they encounter. So one might be not providing or verifying an email address. When setting this up, an email is not required, but it will make retrieving like a forgotten password really hard. Same thing if they don't set up a phone number when they're creating this, it makes retrieving any forgotten passwords very difficult. Verifying your email, if you enter in an email address when setting this up, it is going to send a verification email to that email address. So it's very important that a student just automatically goes in and completes that verification email to retrieve that code so that the FSA ID account can have immediate access to their email. If they don't do this immediately, it can create some issues if they're trying to log back in later. The other thing that happens quite often is that parents will say, well, I'm just going to set up all of the different accounts that everybody needs, or students will sometimes say, I'm going to set up my account and also my parents' account. And although that seems very helpful, it can create some issues later on. if, you know, students or parents are entering in the wrong information for different accounts. So for example, we've had plenty of parents who are setting up an account for themselves and also setting up an account for their student. But then, you know, halfway through the session, they get interrupted, they come back to it and they think they're creating their own account when in fact they were creating their students' accounts. So, you know, they might switch the social, or they might switch their names, or they might switch their email addresses. So when they try to log back in later, their information doesn't match and their student logs in, but they're really looking like they're the parent, or the parent logs in and they look like they're the student. So we really, really encourage that students set up their own FSA ID and password, and parents set up their own FSA ID and password, so that there can be no chance for confusion on whose information they are setting up.
Questions?
Any questions about the FAFSA, well, logging into the FAFSA and setting up an FSA ID?
And you can use the raise hand function or type it into the chat.
I'm not seeing any raised hands at this point.
Perfect, we answered everything. Great. All right, so let's move on to the reason you're all here, right? Changes to the 21-22 FAFSA. Well, guess what? There are no major changes to the 21-22 FAFSA, so we're done, right? So really the only things happening with the FAFSA this year are very minor. The 21-22 FAFSA demo site actually just got an email about that yesterday. So you can go out to the FAFSA demo site and do a practice FAFSA if you'd like to get some practice actually doing a FAFSA. There are screenshots available, and you can also use the FAFSA forecaster as well. So that is ready to go. The My Student Aid mobile app can now be used for creating the FSA ID and submitting FAFSAs, new and renewals. So they did make that little upgrade to the mobile app. And I would say the biggest change, and one that financial aid administrators are the most excited about, is the change to the Schedule 1 on the FAFSA with the IRS data retrieval tool. So now if a parent or a student uses the IRS data retrieval tool, it will automatically pull over whether or not the student or parent filed a Schedule 1, and they will not be asked this question. I know many of you have helped students file FAFSAs, and the Schedule 1 question can be tricky for students. So this makes it much easier if they use the IRS data retrieval tool. It will automatically pull that information over. And then there was some minor language changes to the Schedule 1 question. So very minor things with that. But we're very excited about the Schedule 1 being pulled over directly when using the data retrieval tool. So it's even more important now to use that. So during this presentation, we are going to go over kind of some common FAFSA issues that you may see or that you may be helping your students with. These are kind of the most common errors I think that financial aid administrators get. We're going to talk about the social security number, date of birth, legal name, and how that all has to match, and also the gender question. We'll talk about dependent student versus independent. So when can a student file a FAFSA without their parents' information, and when do they have to include their parents' information on the FAFSA? We'll talk about which parent to put on the FAFSA in cases where parents are not married, or they're divorced or separated or widowed. We'll talk about household size. And that one seems to trip students up quite a bit. Who lives in my house? We'll talk about undocumented students and parents and how to troubleshoot some issues they might have. And we'll also talk about reporting untaxed income and assets. And then we'll talk a little bit about special circumstances. So that's kind of the rundown on what we're going to be talking about. So let's start with social security number, date of birth, legal name, and gender. So these are big ones in that if you make a mistake on the first three, social security number, date of birth, legal name, nothing matches within the FAFSA. So when a student does a FAFSA, it runs through many government databases to match to make sure people are in there. And one of the databases it runs through is the Social Security Administration. So if a student puts a social security number in there that does not match their name, it is going to reject and not be processed until the student fixes it. So it is very crucial, like Leah said earlier, that the student really needs to enter that social security number correctly. If a student reports an incorrect social security number, this is the only issue that cannot be fixed. I can't fix it, Leah can't fix it, the Secretary of Education can't fix it, no one can fix it. The student has to log in and just do a brand new FAFSA. So they just have to start from scratch and start over with the correct social security number. The reason is that's never going to match them. So it's very important. Same on the parent side. The parent that is going to be reported on the FAFSA, their social security number also runs through the Social Security Administration. However, theirs is easier to fix. To fix a parent's social security number, they can just log in and fix it on the FAFSA. You don't have to start a new one. With date of birth, the student can fix their date of birth if they enter it incorrectly just by making a correction to their FAFSA. But the FAFSA will not be processed if one of those two things and the legal name are not reflected in the Social Security Administration database. So the legal name, the student needs to put their name exactly how it appears on their Social Security card. So let's say parent got remarried and student wants to change their name to whatever their step parent is. If they have not submitted everything and it's not been processed through Social Security, they need to put their name as it appears on their card the day they file the FAFSA. So we see a lot of mismatches when students do get married or when parents get married and they change their name. Also, if they have a nickname, if they go by Bob, but they're really Robert, they can't put Bob on the FAFSA, they need to put Robert. So they need to put their legal name exactly how it appears on their FAFSA, or it will not process and it will reject. The other question that students get tripped up on is the gender question. So lucky, males are lucky, they get to register for selective service if we ever have a draft. So Uncle Sam says, if you want financial aid, you get to be drafted, right? And so all male students have to register for selective service. And the FAFSA is really nice and it automatically registers you for selective service as long as you check that question. So it doesn't know to do that though if you report your gender incorrectly, or let's say you are transitioning. If you were born biologically male but you identify as female, you have to put the gender on your birth certificate. So whatever you were assigned at birth, even though you identify as female. Now, if you were born female, but now you identify as male, you would actually put female on your FAFSA because it's going to ask for sex assigned at birth. So that can trip students up a little bit. And so like I said, parent's name, social security number, date of birth also has to match what the Social Security Administration has on file. But the good thing is parent just needs a first initial. So as long as that first initial matches, it'll go through. And those fields can easily be corrected on the FAFSA. All of these things on the slide can be corrected except the student social security number. So that one cannot be fixed. And again, what happens is the FAFSA rejects and does not produce an EFC. So when a financial aid administrator gets it, we don't see any kind of EFC. It's just a completely rejected application. So those are the big ones. Does anyone have any questions?
We did have a raised hand earlier. Kimberly Jackson, do you want to ask your question? You can unmute and ask.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask about a FSA ID question for students who forget their email, their password, like everything that you can use to retrieve it, including the security questions. Like, what can a student do from there?
So if a student forgets their email, there is an option for a forgotten email. They also have an option for a forgotten password. If they cannot remember their security questions and they haven't set up a phone number to do a retrieval or an email to do a retrieval, then
They have to call.
yeah.
Fortunately, if they don't know anything and they don't remember the email they set up and they didn't attach that mobile phone, they're going to have to call 1-800-4-FED-AID or 1-800-433-3243. That's the main helpline for FAFSA, and they're going to probably have to reset their ID. But as long as they have an email that works, if they forgot their password, if they forgot their username, they can retrieve everything through that email and through if they've set up the phone number. So that's why it's really important, I think, more than ever to set up a mobile phone number. It just makes it much more easy and streamlined and quick. And I always have to do this with my husband every year who does the income-based payment. He never remembers it, so we always have to do that. So I'm very familiar with that process. So,
Okay.
but otherwise, they would just have to call.
And what was that number?
1-800-4-FED-A.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question that was submitted through the chat box that I thought would be a good one for everyone. Can you talk a little bit about the Schedule 1 question? What questions are on there? It sounded like there were some that weren't quite familiar with that part of the tax forms and what's being asked on the FAFSA.
Yeah, so the Schedule 1, you normally have to file, let me back up. This is way more information than you probably need, but it might help give some context. So there are 3 formulas on the FAFSA that determine your level of need. The first one is you can automatically get a 0 expected family contribution if you make below a certain amount. The second is called simple needs, where the FAFSA will ignore your assets if you say yes to certain questions. This is one of those questions. So if a family makes less than a certain amount, I think it's like $56,000 or $57,000. Don't quote me on that because I haven't looked it up yet for this year. But if they make less than that and they can say yes to means tested benefits like school lunches, TANF, WIC, those kinds of things, and they did not file a Schedule 1, the FAFSA will automatically not ask you questions about your assets. You get to skip the assets. And that's a good thing, right? Because if you've got a lot of money in your bank account, all of that money has to count towards your expected family contribution. And if you have rental properties or you have any kind of assets, those are going to have to count towards your expected family contribution. So the Schedule 1 weeds out students who don't need to report their assets and students who do need to report their assets. So there are some people who have to file a Schedule 1 to report certain things. So on the Schedule 1, it asks if you had to file a Schedule 1 for any reason other than to report these things, you answer, no, I did not file a Schedule 1. So that would be if you filed a Schedule 1 to report unemployment, educator expenses, IRA deduction, student loan interest deduction, Alaska Permanent Fund dividend, or virtual currency, like if you've got some Bitcoin hanging out, then you would still be able to answer no to that question, that you didn't file a Schedule 1. And if you filed it for other reasons, you have to say yes. And it essentially boils down to, does the FAFSA skip your assets or does it not skip your assets? Was that way more than you needed to know?
I think that covered it well.
Okay.
I am not seeing other hands at this time. If you all would like to move on.
All right, okay, perfect. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about is dependent versus independent status on the FAFSA. And what this really refers to is whether or not a student who is filling out the FAFSA is going to be required to put parent information on the FAFSA or not. Okay, so a dependent student is a student who is required to put some sort of parent information on the FAFSA. An independent student is not required to put parent information on the FAFSA. The way that the FAFSA determines whether or not a student is dependent or independent is these questions on the FAFSA. So, is the student born before January 1st of 1998? Are they a veteran of the military? Are they active duty military? Are they married? Do they have children or other dependents that they support financially? Are both parents deceased? Have they been in foster care after the age of 13? Have they been a dependent or ward of the court after age of 13? Are they an emancipated minor? Are they in a legal guardianship situation through the age of 18? Or are they homeless or at risk of being homeless? If a student says no to all of these questions on the FAFSA, then they are considered a dependent student and must put parent information on the FAFSA. So what if these don't fit the student situation? There are situations in which we can do what's called a dependency override. And what that is basically if a student is in some extreme situation where they do not have contact with their parents or it is unsafe for them to contact their parents. So let's say like, you know, maybe parents are incarcerated and so they really can't get in contact with them, or their parents just abandoned them, or it is some sort of an abusive relationship and the student really shouldn't be in contact with their parents. In those types of situations, a financial aid office can do what's called a dependency override. And so the student would need to come into the financial aid office, discuss with the person in that office what's going on. They provide a little bit of information, and then that office can override their FAFSA and allow the FAFSA to go through and be processed with just the student's information on there. We cannot do dependency overrides just because a parent doesn't want to put their stuff on the FAFSA. We cannot do dependency overrides just because a student thinks that they're independent. It's very important for me to point out that independent and dependent status has nothing to do with your tax status. It has nothing to do with whether or not your parents are going to pay for college. It has everything to do with the way that you answer those questions on the FAFSA. So even if a student files their own taxes and their parents do not claim them on their taxes and they financially support themselves and they're all financially independent, that doesn't matter. That has nothing to do with the way that the FAFSA determines an independent or a dependent student. It has everything to do with the way they answer those questions. So if you are interested in learning more about what a dependency override is and other special situations that might come up with students and families, there is a workshop that CASFA is putting on November 18th that will discuss all these scenarios. There's a panel of people who are very experienced in these areas who will be able to ask questions and address any of those concerns that you have with any of your special situations. So the next thing we're going to go over is who is my parent? So when a student is required to put parent information on the FAFSA, we might think that that is simple, but as we all know, families come in a lot of shapes and sizes and different scenarios. And so sometimes figuring out who is the parent that should be on the FAFSA can actually be a little bit difficult. So there's actually a really great little chart here that we're showing you that's available on the studentaid.gov website as well that makes it a lot easier to figure out who that parent should be on the FAFSA. So if both of your parents are married to each other, then both of them should be reported on the FAFSA, okay? If your parents are not married, but they live together, whether they are technically separated or divorced, if they live under the same household, then both of those parents should be on the FAFSA. If your parents are divorced, then you only need to place one parent on the FAFSA, but it does need to be the parent that you lived with the most over the past 12 months. So if parents are divorced and student lives with dad for 9 months out of the year and lives with mom for 3 months out of the year, then they would need to put dad on the FAFSA. If parents are divorced and student lives with both of them equally, so let's say they trade off every other week, then the next little piece of information that they would use to decide which parent to put on the FAFSA is who financially supports them more in the past 12 months. So if student lives with both parents equally, then who provides the most money to them to support them in the past 12 months? Okay. In the event that a student is putting a parent on a FAFSA that has gotten remarried, then in those situations, the step parent would also need to be put on the FAFSA, and that's regardless of whether or not the step parent has adopted the student, and it's regardless of whether or not the step parent provides any financial support or whether or not they are supporting the student financially through college. Regardless of any of that, a step parent does need to be placed on the FAFSA if they are remarried to a student's biological parent. So at the bottom, you'll see that there are a variety of different people that are not considered parents on the FAFSA. I think the biggest ones that we get are sometimes students will list their grandparents or an aunt or uncle on the FAFSA because they live with them. But if a grandparent or an aunt and uncle or some other family member or person that is, that they're living with is not someone that has legally adopted them, then they should not put them on the FAFSA as a parent. Okay. So another thing that trips a lot of students and families up on the FAFSA is household size. So this is going to look a little bit different for dependent students versus independent students. So for dependent students, the people that they should count in the household size on the FAFSA would be themselves as the student, their parents, so any parents that are living in that household, and then any other children or dependents that those parents support. So for example, let's say a student has two siblings. One of them lives with their parent because they're still in high school, and another one is in college, but the parents still support them. They would put both of those siblings in the household along with their parents and then themselves as a student. Okay, another situation might be maybe parents are taking care of one of their parents, so a grandmother, for example. If the parents are financially supporting that grandmother, they would also place that grandmother in the household size. For independent students, the household size is going to include the student. If they are married, it will include their spouse. And if they have children or other dependents that they support financially, so the student supports those folks financially, then they would place those children and other dependents as folks in the household size. So are there any questions about independent versus independent dependent status, household size, or the who is my parent chart?
Usually this section has lots of questions, folks, so raise your hands, don't be shy. Okay, I do have a question in the chat box. If parents are supporting cousins or other children of family members, that counts in the household size, correct?
Yes, if they're living with them and they're supporting them financially, then that would also count in the household size.
Anyone that they support by 51% technically.
Other questions?
If parents are out of the picture and the student lives with the grandparents, who do they claim as their parent?
So if parents are out of the picture and student is not in contact with parents and nobody else has legally adopted them, then they would not put anyone as a parent on the FAFSA. What they would do is that they would fill out their information as the student, and they would then need to reach out to their financial aid office to discuss a dependency override situation.
Unless the student was placed in legal guardianship, or if both parents are deceased. So if the student is an orphan or ward of the court, then they answer yes to those questions on the FAFSA, because those are part of the dependency questions.
Another question that came in, if the student is homeless, what do they list?
So that's one of the dependency questions. Are you homeless or at risk of being homeless? And they will answer yes to that question on the FAFSA. So they would not report parent information. As long as they can answer yes to one of those 13 dependency questions, they do not list parent information.
Okay, I think we're good to go forward.
Was there another one, step parent that lives in the house?
Yes, there is. So if the step parent that lives in the home has additional children that do not live in the home, but they financially support them, do those additional children count?
So the answer to that question would be yes.
As long as it's 51% support, they have to be supporting. So they would need to look at the rent that student pays elsewhere, because even if you're in college, if you're enrolled in at least 6 hours and you're living in a dorm, you're not living with your parent, but they can still claim you in their household because they're still financially supporting you. So it would be anyone the parent is supporting by 51%. They would have to figure that out.
We have a couple more that have popped up. If a parent is living with another adult and not remarried, is that person's income considered on the FAFSA?
That is not one I've encountered.
Are they the biological parent or adoptive parent? If no, they're not on the FAFSA. So if they're just living with another adult and that adult is not the student's biological or adoptive or step parent, they are not reported on the FAFSA.
Okay, and if the parent you live with is remarried, you would just use that parent, step parent, and the other biological is just out of the picture.
That would be correct.
Okay, I think let me look one more time for hands. Looks like we're good.
Okay, our next section is about undocumented students and parents and kind of what to do to be able to help some of these students out. Let's start with undocumented parents. So if you have a student who's filing their FAFSA and their parent is undocumented, or let's say they just don't have a social security number because they're not a US citizen, the social security number should be reported as all zeros. And the reason is because if you put some kind of social security number in there, a lot of undocumented people pay taxes and they have a taxpayer ID and it starts with a 9 and looks just like a social security number. Sometimes they will put that in there and what happens? It rejects. So it goes through the Social Security Administration. It sees that that number is not really a social, it doesn't match the person on file and the FAFSA rejects. So if a student has a parent who doesn't have a social security number or is undocumented, they just need to list all zeros to stop it from rejecting when they put that on the FAFSA. The other thing about undocumented parents or just parents without a social, they cannot get an FSA ID. In order to sign up for the FSA ID and to be able to electronically sign a FAFSA using that ID, you have to have a valid social security number because it runs again through the Social Security Administration database. So whenever you create that FSA ID, it's running that match behind the scenes. And if it comes up that it doesn't match, the FSA ID cannot be created. So that means that undocumented parents have to print the signature page and mail it directly to FAFSA for processing. So once the student gets to the end of the FAFSA, there's an option that says other signing options. They can click on that and says print a signature page. They would print it, parent would sign it, they would mail it in, and that's how that type of parent will sign the FAFSA. Also, if the student is making any corrections to their FAFSA, if they only are correcting their information, only the student has to re-sign. But if the student goes in and alters any of that parent data or parent information, anytime the parental data is altered, the parent will have to print another signature page and mail it into FAFSA for processing. So that is on the parent side. On the student side, if you are working with a student who is undocumented, or let's say they have DACA, which is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. DACA is a program to allow a student to legally work in the United States for a period of time and get a valid driver's license, but it is not a path to citizenship at all. So you cannot become a citizen if you have DACA, and it does not grant you any rights to federal or state financial aid. So if you are undocumented or if you're approved for DACA, you're not eligible for federal financial aid. DACA students, it can be a little bit more confusing because they are given a valid social security number because it allows them to work. Basically, you just need to view DACA as a work permit. It's their way to work legally in the United States, but the social security number does not grant them access to federal financial aid. So one thing that these types of students can qualify for is in-state tuition at our state schools. So if a student is undocumented or DACA, and they attended a Kansas high school for 3 years and they graduated from that Kansas high school, they're eligible for in-state tuition if they're at a college that charges out-of-state and in-state rates. KU would be an example, Pitt State, Fort Hays, all of the Regents institutions have an in-state rate and an out-of-state rate, and it's a Kansas bill, so it's not specific at specific colleges. It's House Bill 2145, and it's applied to all of our state schools. So they can apply to have the in-state rate instead of paying the out-of-state rate as long as they graduated from that Kansas high school and attended there for 3 years. So we get a lot of questions, should an undocumented or DACA student file the FAFSA? We get this more from DACA students because they do have a social security number. I tell them no, because again, it runs the social security number through the Social Security Administration database and it rejects because you cannot find a valid social attached to that person because it's really a work permit. It's not a valid social security number in terms of financial aid. So it's going to reject and it's not going to calculate an EFC. So a lot of times students want to fill it out because they need to have their financial need assessed, or they need to show financial need for maybe a scholarship or something else. The FAFSA isn't going to do that for you because it's going to reject and it's not going to show an EFC. So I tell students not to fill this out. If a student is going out of state, like California or Arizona, some of those other states do have aid for these types of students. So they would need to check with that individual school to see what they recommend. But at a state school in Kansas, we can't really do anything with that FAFSA. Most schools have a separate application that they have for undocumented or DACA students. Like at the University of Kansas, there's a separate form that they fill out so they can assess their financial need without the student doing a FAFSA. And we will have that session on special situations, and this is part of that. So if you have a specific scenario that you would like to bring up, we will be covering that at that November 18th session. I am going to give you a little time for questions on this. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, we are going to move on then to the IRS data retrieval tool. This is my best friend and all of the financial aid. Oh, we just had a question come through. Is there any risk for parents if they reveal they are undocumented? No, we don't know because we don't go into individual students' FAFSAs and look at that. We just care that some kind of parent has matched. But we're not really looking at a social security number, and I wouldn't ever be able to tell really unless I logged onto a FAFSA and saw the zeros that that parent was undocumented. What alerts me to an issue is when they don't put a social in there or they put the taxpayer ID, then it comes through as a reject. But if they're putting all zeros, it just comes through like a normal FAFSA. So they shouldn't be at risk by just putting all zeros. Because also it's not just reserved for undocumented parents. If you're a British citizen and you live in Britain, but your kids live here, you're not a US citizen, so you would put all zeros. So we don't know if you're a citizen of some other country or if you're living here as undocumented. There's no distinction. Good question. So IRS data retrieval tool, again, is the financial aid administrator's best friend because it makes it, first of all, easier for the student and the parent to file the FAFSA. Because back in the day, like when I did the FAFSA, you had your stack of 80 pages of tax documents and you had to look through and check each line item and make sure you were putting the right line item. The FAFSA also will ask you to take line 4B minus 4C on a Schedule 1, and it can get a little bit complicated. So the IRS data retrieval tool minimizes a lot of room for error because the student, instead of typing in all of the tax data, they will just link to the IRS, put in their FSA ID and password, click yes, I want to pull my tax data over, and it will automatically pull over everything the IRS has on file and place it on their FAFSA. Same with the parent. Parent can go in and select to use the tool, and it's going to put it in accurately without mistake. So it really is going to reduce errors on the student and parent side. And it makes us happy because it reduces verification paperwork. I know many of you have helped your students through verification processes at various schools. If a student uses the IRS data retrieval tool, we do not need copies of their tax returns. In most cases, we just need them to fill out maybe a worksheet for us or provide a W-2. We rarely need to collect those tax documents from the parent or the student. So it makes it a lot easier. Again, here is where that change for 21-22 is visible. The IRS will transfer that Schedule 1 information to the FAFSA and the student will not have to answer it. So please, please, please tell your students to use the IRS data retrieval tool. So this is what it's going to look like when you're in the FAFSA. You have like several ways to say no to this. It's kind of funny. I call them the chicken exits on the IRS data retrieval tool. I think it asks you 3 or 4 times, are you sure you want to transfer? Are you sure? Are you sure? So they just need to click past that so that they can link to the IRS. In order to be able to successfully use this tool, the marital status on the FAFSA must match the tax return. So if a parent just got married and they filed a single return, that person unfortunately is not going to be able to use the IRS data retrieval tool because they filed a single return and they're now married, so that's a mismatch. Likewise, if the parents were married and they filed a joint return, but now those parents are divorced or separated, or one parent is no longer in the picture otherwise, then the FAFSA, it's not going to link through the IRS data retrieval tool because that filing status does not match. You can use it if you filed an amended return, which is wonderful. You can't use it if you have a foreign return or a Puerto Rican return. So those are the ones you can't use it for: marital status not matching or a foreign tax return. But everyone else should be able to use it. When you get to this point in the FAFSA, you do have to enter the FSA ID and password. So I know a lot of you have FAFSA nights and you help your students through this. If the parent is not there and the student gets to the parent portion where they need to transfer their information, the student cannot enter their parent's FSA ID and password into this section to use the data retrieval tool. Only the parent can do that. So unfortunately, the parent does need to be there to be able to do this, or the student has to stop and then the parent has to do this at a later date, because you will need that information in order to transfer it to the IRS. And then when the student receives the information back in their student aid report, the data is going to be hidden. So when they review it, it just will say transferred from the IRS. So you're not going to be able to see the figures listed on their student aid report. I'm going to open up for any questions about the data retrieval tool.
We have a question in the chat. What if one parent has passed away? Can they still use the retrieval tool?
No, because you answer on the FAFSA, are you divorced, separated, or widowed? You would answer widowed. And because there's only one parent on the FAFSA and it's a joint return, you're not going to be able to use it. Now, if the parent is alive when you file the FAFSA, you can, but then later you might contact the school to remove that other parent's information from the FAFSA. So it depends on the date that that parent passes away and the day you file the FAFSA. And there's no cost to use the data retrieval tool, it's free. And I think there was another one about foster care. We can go back to that.
Yes, you're correct. There is a question.
So foster care, the FAFSA asks you at any time after the age of 13, were you in foster care? Even if you were in foster care one day, the day after your 13th birthday, you would put yes on the FAFSA. So you would answer yes to the foster care question. And again, we're going to have that session about these special situations. So if you have something more detailed, bring it to that session. Anything else that would up to what we've covered so far?
I did get another question regarding the data retrieval tool and being able to use it. Does the information listed on the IRS DRT need to match the information they listed on their tax returns? Example, street, address, exactly as it was on the return.
Yes. So they'll have to know what address they were at when they filed their taxes, because if they put in a different address, it's a matching tool. So think of it like we've really harped on Social Security Administration, has to match the name, has to match the date of birth, right? Same with the IRS. It's trying to look in a giant database for your information. So it's matching your name, matching your social, and it's matching that address that you use to file your tax return. So it does need to appear exactly so it can pull over the correct Bob Smith that lives at 1521 15th Street. Good question. Because if it doesn't match, it's not going to pull it over, and it can be very frustrating. All right, moving on to assets. These are sometimes hard for people to understand, even for financial aid administrators. Like, we don't have a lot of assets, most of us, at least my friends that I know in financial aid. So sometimes it can get a little tricky when you kind of get in the weeds with a family. You're like, I don't even know what a mutual fund is. I don't have these kinds of things. Luckily, there is a help and hint section in the FAFSA. As you go through, their little question marks you can click, and it does a pretty good job of defining what some of these things are. But kind of in a nutshell, you're going to report certain assets on the FAFSA and you're going to leave certain things off. So what you're going to report is your cash in your bank account the day you file your FAFSA, and your savings account and checking account. So pay all your bills the day before you file the FAFSA, right? Your rental properties. So if you have any kind of rental properties, you'll report any money earned from that. Trust funds, money market, mutual funds, stocks, bonds, CDs, gold under your bed, silver, any of that stuff. 529 plans. There is a little weird thing about 529 plans. And if the 529 plan is in the student's name, if they're a dependent student and they had to put their parent on the FAFSA, they will actually report that 529 under the parent's name, even if it's in the student's name. Now, that wouldn't be true if it's an independent student who did not have to put parent on the FAFSA. Also, you report any business net worth if you have a business that you have more than 100 full-time employees. That kind of weeds it down a little bit. So let's talk about don't report. I'm actually going to start with businesses because this is the one where students and parents mess up the most. They have a small business, maybe they've got a metal fabrication business, it's a small shop, they have 5 employees. You're not going to report the business net worth of that shop because you have fewer than 100 full-time employees. Same with the family farm. You're not going to report that unless you have a business farm and again, you have more than 100 employees. So that rules out your Mary Kay business, Tupperware, Pampered Chef, all of that stuff. So you're only going to be reporting your business net worth if you have more than 100 people that work for you. You also do not report the value of the home you live in. Back in the day, you used to have to report that. You don't report that. You only would report if you've got rental properties. You also don't report the value of any life insurance or your retirement plans. So those are protected. And the FAFSA is going to ask you to report your net worth. And your net worth is really the current value of all of your assets minus the debt you may owe on any of those assets. I had a really fun time. I went and did a financial aid night at KCC for the Kansas City, Kansas School District TRIO program. And then immediately the next day went to my hometown in Abilene, and we were literally counting 4-H cows. And we had a question come up about, well, I have the cow, but I haven't sold it. Is that an asset or investment, or does it only become that after you sell the cow? And so it was just very different. Students have lots of different situations depending on where you work in the state of Kansas. You could be dealing with cattle or not. It's kind of fun. All right, let's talk about untaxed income. So there are some things that are not reported on a tax return, but the FAFSA still counts that as money or something towards your expected family contribution. It still is going to take those things into consideration. So untaxed income, you're going to report any child support received. So if you have any children that you're getting child support from, you would report that on your FAFSA. You're also going to report any kind of untaxed portions of IRA distributions or pensions, or if you've got a health savings account. If you're in the military or you're clergy and you have a housing or food allowance, you'll report that. If you're a veteran and you've got non-education benefits, you'll report those. You'll also report workers' compensation and also any kind of money received or paid on the student's behalf from someone not on the FAFSA. So let's say grandma and grandpa, I don't know, give student $500 a month for no reason. You would have to report that on the FAFSA. But if parents are giving student $500 a month for no reason, maybe they have a lot of chores, they work on the farm selling their 4-H cows, they would not report that because that is from the parent, but they would have to report any money from someone who's not the parent. So basically someone who's not on the FAFSA, they would report that. More untaxed income. This is what you do not report. So you're not going to report any kind of pension rollover or IRA. Those do not count. Also, you don't report the value of your on-base military housing. You don't report student aid on the FAFSA. You don't report earned income credit, welfare payments, any kind of untaxed Social Security benefits or Social Security disability or supplemental security income or any flexible spending plan benefits. So that's a list of things you do not have to report on the FAFSA. All right, any questions about what we've covered so far?
We do have a few questions. I think several would like you to circle back to the cow question and tell them whether or not it's counted as an asset.
So we had a student who actually had a bunch of cattle, and they were counted in the investment net worth. So she had to figure out what would the value of my cattle be if I sold them today, and she had to report that as net worth. The kid who already sold the cow, they had to report that on their tax return already. So it was already counting on their tax return, and they did not have to report it as an asset because it was already sold. It was very interesting. And I had to pull out the FAFSA and do some research on that one.
I had another question in the chat box earlier as you were talking about savings, checking accounts, and information reported on the FAFSA. Do they ever ask for proof of accounts, or how do you know they're being honest?
So it depends on the school. We do not as part of our verification process, but if we ever question it, that is something we could technically ask for if we were ever doubting it. But generally speaking, no, we're not going to be looking at that the day you file the FAFSA. So it's kind of on your honor system.
A couple more questions coming. If a step parent collects retirement, do they report that?
Generally speaking, no. Not unless they're filing a tax return and it's actually part of that tax return somewhere.
Another great question that I'm sure we're going to have come up, do we claim the stimulus money that was sent out in April?
So the latest guidance on that is no. Because that was technically a tax credit that we lost coming up. So I don't believe we're counting that. Whitney, do you know any more about that?
Your response is the same as what I'm aware of.
Okay.
At this point, I don't believe it would be included.
Okay.
We should have more guidance before that. I mean, the tax year that is in would be 2020, which would be for next year's,
Mm-hmm.
not the current application that's about to open, but the following. So we should have more guidance before that really arrives.
Right. So for 2019, it's not part of it because it's not part of the tax year that we're looking at. You're right. Okay. Verification, everyone's favorite thing. So verification is a process that the Department of Education selects a percentage of students basically for quality assurance. We want to make sure that the people getting the money are the people who should be getting the money. So the student is selected at the department level, not necessarily the school level, but the school can choose to select certain people if they choose to do so. But what that basically means for you helping students is that if they're selected by the Department of Education, that means they are selected at every single school that they attend. So they have to complete verification at Fort Hays, at Bethany, at Wichita Area Technical. They have to complete it at every single school they're interested in attending. And it's a federal requirement, so the school cannot waive it if selected at the departmental level. In some cases, it will prevent any aid from being awarded to a student. So we will not even offer a student financial aid if they're not done with verification, because the whole point of verification is to see if you made a mistake. So we don't want to award you aid and then have to come back and say, oh, well, your FAFSA was wrong. You reported 4 people in your house and you only have 2, and then your expected family contribution changes. Therefore, your aid changes. But some schools, like some private schools, will go ahead and offer a student financial aid before they're done with this process and then just revise it later. So it is up to the school on whether or not they will offer aid or not offer aid. I would say the majority of us will not, because it kind of is a risk for us. And also it provides the student with an inaccurate picture of what it's going to cost them to attend that school, because their EFC could be way off and maybe they're not getting as much financial aid as they thought they were getting. But one thing I never like to hear, it is not an audit. So you are selected for verification. It's not the government auditing your FAFSA. It doesn't mean you made a mistake. It's just the government selects a certain percentage to make sure that these people are filing FAFSAs correctly. So the school's going to ask for the documents you use to file the FAFSA. So what do we generally need to file a FAFSA? We need your name, household information. Are you in college? We need your tax information and all of your schedules, right? So generally schools are going to be asking for that type of information. And if you utilize the IRS data retrieval tool, we will not need those tax documents. So usually a student can get by with just filling out a simple worksheet for the school if they use the data retrieval, and it makes the process much more simple. There are various types of verification. Some students have to provide proof that they graduated from high school because, yes, believe it or not, there are diploma mills out there that are fake high schools, and you have to have a diploma or a GED to get financial aid. So sometimes people will fake that to get Pell at schools. Sometimes we need you to verify in person you are who you say you are to prevent fraud. So there are different levels of verification. So if you have a student selected, they need to just check with the school as to what documents they need to submit. A pro tip, if you're looking at a student's student aid report and you see a small little asterisk by their EFC, so it says like 0 and then there's a little star thing, that means they're selected for verification. Anytime you see an asterisk by their EFC, that means they are selected. All right, so putting in our last piece of the puzzle, once the FAFSA is submitted, the student should review their student aid report. They can review it online or in their app for mistakes. Anything that was transferred over from the IRS will be masked and it will just say transferred from IRS. Once they've reviewed that and ensured this is correct information, they will complete verification at every single school if they are selected. Also, do not just turn in a tax return as a preemptive kind of thing to do, because if you turn in tax documents and you weren't selected for verification, now you are. So anytime you turn in tax documents unsolicited, the school will put you through verification. So do not turn anything in unless you're notified by the school that you have to turn it in. And then comes the money, so financial aid offers. And schools have different deadlines and priority dates by which you need to file your FAFSA in order to get financial aid. So it's important that the school or that the student check with every single school to see what the priority date is to make sure they get their FAFSA in by that date. Because earlier FAFSA doesn't really necessarily mean earlier offers, but it could depending on what type of school they're going to. I can tell you private schools like to award fast because they want to get you in the door. They're competing, right? I would say we all kind of are, but private schools are really good about getting financial aid offers out earlier to their students. Big public schools like K-State, KU, Wichita State are probably not going to award until maybe January, February, some maybe even in March. So you do the FAFSA October 1, you might not hear something until February. Smaller schools or community colleges, we're not going to award you at Johnson County until April. So you could be filing your FAFSA October 1 and you're not going to hear about any kind of money until April. But most schools will contact you before that if you're selected for verification. So usually in December, we start emailing students to say, hey, you're selected, you need to turn your stuff in, you have until April. And then they wait and they turn it in August and they're like, where's my money? It happens every year. So tell your students to pay attention to those priority dates.
Okay. So the next thing we're going to discuss is something else that could happen after you submit your FAFSA. So assuming that you have submitted your FAFSA and let's say, you were selected for verification, you completed all of that, and then you finally get your financial aid package and it's not quite what you expected, or you are thinking, oh, I don't know how I'm going to afford this because something just changed. Parent lost a job, maybe a parent recently retired, something in the household has changed financially. And so they're looking at the information on the FAFSA and saying, this doesn't match my current financial situation. That is where a process called professional judgment would come in. Some schools call it professional judgment, other schools might call it something else, but it is overall usually called professional judgment. So what this process is a process that a student and or family would do with their financial aid office to reevaluate the information that is listed on their FAFSA. So as we stated before, when you're filling out the FAFSA for the 21-22 academic year, it is based off of 2019 financial information. And a lot can change between 2019 and 2020 or 2019 and 2021. I mean, as we all know, during COVID times, there is a lot of changes going on with people's employment, how many hours they're working, all of these things. So this is where professional judgment comes in. So if anything in the household has changed financially, and it really changes that picture that's happening, then the student and family would want to reach out to their financial aid office to start this process and see if by going through this process, they might become eligible for different types of aid or additional types of aid. So the whole point of professional judgment is to try to get better aid for the student. So let's say they're only eligible for unsubsidized loans when they file the FAFSA the first time around, but something's changed and now they're going through professional judgment. The goal would be to make them eligible for subsidized loans or to make them eligible for maybe some grant money. Anytime that something has changed financially in the household, we encourage students to reach out to the financial aid office at the institution that they're interested in. If they are still interested in multiple institutions at this point, they will need to go through this process for each individual school that they want to get a new financial aid package from after this process happens. Again, dependency override is another situation that we talked about earlier, that a student would need to start with the financial aid office to get that all done, figured out, and completed. And so really, we encourage students and families to work together through a professional judgment process because normally through these processes, the financial aid office is going to ask for a lot of different types of information, documentation that the student may not necessarily have access to. So we do encourage that if students are considering going through professional judgment and they have parent information on the FAFSA, we do ask them to include their parents in on that process. So the next thing is that the reason we're not going into too much detail today about unique different situations with professional judgment and dependency override and foster care and all the different things is because we do have another session that CASFA is putting on November 18th of this year that will specifically address all of those very specific situations. And so if you have, very specific situations you want to submit, we definitely are encouraging folks to register for this session and submit their questions ahead of time. There will be a very knowledgeable panel to address all of those questions and address all of these different situations. So we highly encourage you to sign up for that, and it will be recorded and placed on the CASFA website at a later point.
All right, so here are my pro tips for students and parents. Apply early. Make sure you give yourself enough time to fill it out. It can take 30 minutes to fill out. If you have not done your FSA ID, sometimes that can spill over to maybe 40 minutes or an hour, depending on if you have that ID ahead of time. I would say every single student needs to make sure that they have their school's priority date, so that they know, when do I have to file the FAFSA and when do I have to get everything submitted. I would also suggest the student and parent each set up their FSA ID and password ahead of time. Make sure that they have that ready to go when they're sitting down to file the FAFSA, because it will make it go much more quickly and more streamlined, and tell them, please write it down and put it in your little filing cabinet, because you will need it every single year. One thing I didn't cover, but if a parent has multiple students, they will only need one FSA ID and password that they can use on all 6 of their kids' FAFSAs, or however it may be. So they'll only need one of those. I also encourage you to use the IRS data retrieval tool. It makes it go so much more smoothly, both on the student side and the financial aid side. Double check all of your info, especially social security numbers. Look for those alerts and messages throughout the FAFSA. It will usually tell you when you've done something wrong. For example, if you have 4 people who live in your household, but you have 5 people in college, the FAFSA will flag it and it won't let you move forward until you correct it. It will also do that with some of the income information. It knows that you've made a mistake, like when it asks you how much taxes you've paid. If you report that it's more than your AGI, it's going to flag certain things for you and it won't let you move forward unless you fix those. So use those help and hints sections as well throughout the FAFSA. So now we're going to open it up for questions before we tackle our next section. Does anyone have any questions over anything we've covered so far? So one question, why do many junior colleges wait until April or so? That's because many of our students don't really know they're attending a junior college versus a 4-year. Usually students at 4 years are usually more set in what they do because 4-year schools have earlier deadlines. So if you miss a December 1 deadline, that could make or break it for a 4-year school. So we have a lot more lax deadlines because a lot of our students decide last minute whether or not to come. So we wait until later before we start awarding students. Let's see. I think we covered everything in the chat. Okay.
Great. So finally, what does the FAFSA do exactly? So when students and families are filling out the FAFSA, they're entering in all of these different pieces of information. And what the FAFSA does with that is it takes in and assesses a family's ability to pay for their educational expenses and determines what type of aid that student qualifies for. So it's really hard. We get this question a lot, but it's really hard to say, oh, you make this much money, therefore you're going to be eligible for this type of aid, because the FAFSA is really pulling in lots of different types of pieces of information and doing a really long calculation process that we used to have to do by hand, but now it's all electronically done to determine that final number that comes out, which is the expected family contribution. And that expected family contribution, otherwise known as the EFC, is that number that financial aid offices use to determine what type of aid a student is eligible for. And that could be aid definitely from the FAFSA, but also from the state and also from the institution. So that number is very important, and that's what the FAFSA is calculating for you. So that's one of the 2 building blocks that a financial aid office is using to determine aid eligibility. The other building block is what we call cost of attendance, sometimes referred to as COA. And that cost of attendance is determined by each individual school. As you all know, schools can cost wildly different amounts depending on what school you're attending. So KU might cost different than, K-State, which might cost different than Johnson County Community College, which might cost different than Washburn. So it really depends on what school you're attending that determines the cost of attendance. The cost of attendance includes a lot of different types of costs in it, which would include things like tuition, any fees that the institution charges, rates for housing, dining plans, or estimates for students living off campus or with their parents. It'll also include estimates for books, and as well as estimates for things like personal expenses and transportation expenses that the student might have. So all of those different estimates and numbers come together to create that cost of attendance. And what a financial aid office does is it takes that cost of attendance and subtracts that expected family contribution, and that creates what's called financial need. And this is where, this is the number in which need-based aid has to fit into, okay? And so just because a student or a family says, oh, I have financial need, I should get all the grants, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're eligible for grants. We do have to do this calculation of cost of attendance minus estimated family contribution to determine financial need and fit any type of need-based aid into their financial aid package.
And financial need is going to be different at every single school. So schools, that's why schools' financial aid offers are different, because the cost of attendance minus EFC, since that cost of attendance is different at different schools, the financial need will be different.
Okay. So what are the different types of aid that a student could be awarded? Well, the very first one we like to talk about is grants. So grants are basically free money that a student can use towards their education. Generally, if a student is eligible for a grant, they will be awarded that grant through the financial aid office. Normally, most grants that a student is going to be awarded is going to be grants through the FAFSA. So that would include the Pell Grant, the TEACH Grant, the SEOG Grant. The state of Kansas, some schools have an amount of Kansas Comprehensive Grant funds that they can award Kansas residents. And institutions might have institutional grants that they can give out. And so typically grants are going to be need-based pieces of aid. So their expected family contribution number will have to be at a certain level, or they'll have to have a certain amount of need in order to be awarded a grant. So again, grants are free money, but typically need-based. We then have loans, which is everyone's favorite type of aid, right? So loans are going to be typically funds that students or parents have to pay back after they finish school. There are federal loans and there are private loans. Private loans are going to be through like a bank or a private lender. So a variety of different places that you've probably heard about that offer student loans. All of those different processes are going to look different depending on the lender. But federal loans are typically what we would advise students and families to look at first because they have a lot more protections and generally have more repayment options than your private loans are going to have. And typically the interest rates are going to be better on federal loans for the most part, but you might find a really great private loan out there. It just depends. There are different types of federal loans that students and families can obtain. A student can be eligible for two different types of student loans, subsidized loans and unsubsidized loans. Subsidized loans are loans that do not accrue interest while the student is in school. And it is a need-based loan. So a student does have to have financial need, again, COA minus EFC to get that need, in order to be eligible for a subsidized loan. An unsubsidized loan is a loan that does accrue interest while the student is in school, and it continues to accrue interest until the student graduates and pays off the loan in full afterwards. So that unsubsidized loan can be offered to any student who files a FAFSA and still has loan eligibility. There are also loans called PLUS loans. There are Parent PLUS loans that a parent can borrow. That is a loan that a parent borrows and a parent pays back. The student is not a part of that loan whatsoever. And then there are PLUS loans for graduate students as well. So if you work with any graduate students, they can apply for additional loans known as the PLUS loan. We then have Federal Work Study, which is a little bit different in terms of how it kind of works and the way that it's paid to students. So Federal Work Study is money that a student earns through a Federal Work Study job on campus. So at the school that they attend, if they're offered Federal Work Study in their financial aid package, they can then go and apply for Federal Work Study jobs on that campus. And typically how most schools will pay a student Federal Work Study dollars is through a paycheck, just like any other job. But what is really great about being eligible for Federal Work Study is that it opens up more job opportunities that the student can apply for. And any funding that they earn through Federal Work Study does not count against them on the following FAFSA when they have to report their income. That Federal Work Study basically cancels out. So it's not going to change their expected family contribution, for example. Sometimes schools will pay Federal Work Study towards a student's like tuition bill, but we don't see that very often. Usually a student is earning those funds through a paycheck. And then we have scholarships. Scholarships are kind of everywhere, and there are lots of different ways to obtain them. A student could receive scholarships from the school that they're going to, from private or outside organizations or local companies or businesses, their parents' place of employment, from the state, from the Board of Regents. So there are scholarships everywhere that students can apply to. The biggest thing about scholarships is that usually there's going to be some extra effort that a student has to put in. They have to fill out an application, they have to do an interview, they have to submit an essay. There could be lots of different things. And typically students aren't always guaranteed that they're just going to get a scholarship just because they submitted something. So we encourage students to look for scholarships early and often. The earlier they can start applying for scholarships, the better off they're going to be in terms of potentially getting one. We do want to point out before we finish up some resources where you can find more information. So studentaid.gov is the governmental website where students can find information on federal financial aid. They can find information on the FAFSA. They can find information on repayment options for loans. All sorts of things that have to do with federal aid is listed at that website. The financial aid toolkit.ed.gov, that is a really great resource for you all if you are looking for handouts or presentations or descriptions of things that are helpful to explain certain processes to your students and families. So a really great place for you to get some tools and some pieces of information if you tend to put on like financial aid workshops and whatnot. KansasDegreeStats.org is a really great website that outlines all of the different schools in Kansas, and it outlines different costs for various types of degrees at those certain schools, the average debt that a student might incur trying to obtain a certain degree at a different school. So these are all Kansas schools, but it's a really useful website if students are interested in looking at that type of information. CASPA.org, of course, is a place where we would love for you to go to learn more information about financial aid in Kansas and to look at training opportunities and presentations and recordings that we post there. The Net Price Calculator is a tool that every single institution that awards federal financial aid must have on their website. So if you have any students or families who have not quite yet gotten around to filing the FAFSA, or they're not quite ready, maybe they're a freshman in high school, but they really want to know what type of aid they might be eligible for at a particular school. The Net Price Calculator is going to be a great tool for them to use at that school to kind of figure out, okay, I might be looking at these types of pieces of aid there. And then NASFA.org is our National Association for Financial Aid Administrators. Typically, to access a lot of their information, you're going to have a membership, but if you are interested in getting involved in that organization and or accessing any of their trainings, they are a really great resource to learn more about federal aid.
All right, so we have a lot more workshops coming. So we really tried to pare this information down a little bit and pulled out kind of the hot topics like special situations and scholarships to give them their own sessions so that we can really devote a lot of time to your very specific questions about scholarships or about unique student situations. So we've got those workshops coming up. October 21st is our next one, and that will be exploring scholarship opportunities. And we'll have Linda Oldham Burns with Board of Regents at that session. And then unique student situations in the FAFSA. So that's going to be everything from homeless to I don't know where my parents are to maybe I'm undocumented or my parents are undocumented, or foster care, or I just don't know if I qualify as an independent student based on the questions on the FAFSA. So any of those unique student situations you can bring to that session. And that's going to be November 18th. And it'll be a panel of financial aid administrators. So we're going to have a lot of experience from different types of institutions. And I think we'll have everything covered there. Financial literacy. So if you were in this presentation last year, we have a great section on financial literacy. So we're giving that its own session as well. And that will be presented by Leticia Gradington from the University of Kansas and Ivory Smith from Johnson County Community College. That will be on January 13th. And then Financial Aid 102 is going to be the post-FAFSA process. So that's where we're going to talk more detail about how students actually submit various types of paperwork to their school. Maybe they have to prove citizenship, verification, selective service, kind of all of those paperworky types of things around the FAFSA. And also we're going to talk in a lot of detail about financial aid offers. So I'll share several award offers from different schools around the state of Kansas, and we're going to go into detail explaining why schools give certain amounts and really deciphering those student aid offers. That will be on February 16th, and I'll be presenting that session along with Courtney Lockhart from WSU. So those are all of our upcoming sessions. Please, please, please fill out your evaluations. We do listen to you. Every single time we have these workshops, we collect that feedback and we try to incorporate as much of that feedback as we can into the presentation. So let us know if you liked this. Maybe we can do something like this next year, even if we're in person offering both. Because I know a lot of you have to drive quite a ways. Like if we've got our Western Kansas site at Dodge City or Garden, some of you might be coming from really far away to have to drive to those sessions. So if you really like the online, please let us know. Also, if you have any question that you didn't want to ask today or you thought of it later, please put that on your evaluation, and we'll be compiling all of those Q&As to post to the CASFA website. So now I'm going to open it up for questions.
Please feel free to raise your hands if you'd like to ask your question personally, or go ahead and type it into the chat box. It looks like we did have one. Is there an info video that would be appropriate to share with students' parents? We will not be holding an in-person night this year.
So I know there's some, the Department of Education Federal Student Aid has its own YouTube channel, Federal Student Aid, and you can pull videos from FSA directly, and they walk through how to set up an FSA ID, how to do certain parts of the FAFSA. So I would check out Federal Student Aid's YouTube channel.
You also might be able to reach out to your local college and ask if somebody might be able to present via Zoom, or I know some different schools have created their own videos as well that might be helpful for filling out the FAFSA, or, you know, for going through their financial aid process. So reaching out to them could be helpful too. Other questions?
Okay, it looks like we've got another one coming in the chat box. I'm not sure if it's quite done. I've heard of students receiving money from schools once they've decided to attend. Why might that be?
So they could be an athlete or receiving some other type of scholarship. Could be a private school and they want to get students in the door by offering them money as soon as possible. Leah?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess some other offers that could potentially happen is that if a student commits to a certain school, there might be extra money involved. I haven't typically, you know, seen it too much at the school that I work at, but it also could be because of competitive offers. So sometimes when students are considering multiple different schools, they start getting into like this negotiation situation or competition situation where they go to each financial aid office and say, hey, they offered me some, can you offer me more? And that could be another reason why they're receiving aid after their package went out.
Mm-hmm. Like when I went to school, I heard about my music scholarship before I heard anything from the financial aid office. So I knew about that money that I was getting before my full offer had come in. And at community college level, it's really probably athletics. Because I know at Johnson County and at KCK, we're not actually putting those award offers out until later. So a student could get some kind of offer for some kind of special scholarship before the financial aid office actually has put those offers out there.
It might also be from a specific major or school or department that the student has been accepted in later. So for example, like at KU, our different schools like the School of Engineering or the School of Business, they have their own scholarships that they offer after a student is not only admitted to the institution, but then also admitted to the individual schools. So they might receive those notifications at a later point after they've already gotten financial aid from the institution at large. So. Any other questions? We got about 1 more minute. Yeah, so a copy of the PowerPoint slides were emailed to those who were registered for this session, but they should also be offered along with the recording that will be posted on CASFA. It will take us a little bit of time to post the recording and the presentation, but once it's up on CASFA, it'll be available to all of you.
As actually the PowerPoint and the PDF of the slides are out there on the website now and available. But we hope to have the recording up next week, most likely.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much. Like I said, you can access this information at a later point when we post it on the CASFA website. Please, please, please fill out your evaluation, and we really appreciate you guys coming today. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.